Oh, what a delightfully ordinary Tuesday it was at Nexus Academy on Station Omega Prime. The kind of day where nothing could possibly go wrong. Unless, of course, you happen to be hosting the galaxy's most innocent educational exercise, show and tell. Before we begin, YouTube shows me that 93% of you haven't subscribed yet. Subscribing is free, it really supports our community, and I'd love for you to be part of it. Also, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Professor Kelnari adjusted her forearms with practiced efficiency, each appendage organizing a different set of lesson materials, while her compound eyes surveyed the classroom. 23 younglings from 12 different species sat in their specially designed seats, chattering, clicking, humming, and producing the delightful cacophony that any reasonable educator would expect from a diverse group of children. Well, 21 of them were making noise. 2 sat in perfect silence. The Zentorian professor had been teaching for 32 cycles, and in all that time, she'd learned to read the subtle signs of impending classroom chaos. The way young Krillian's head crests fluffed when they were about to screech. How Thakari cubs' tails twitched before they pounced on something. The telltale shimmer that preceded a Vesper child's attempt to phase through their desk. But humans were different. Caleb and Amy sat in the third row, hands folded neatly on their desks, spines straight, eyes forward. They'd been sitting like that for the entire morning session, not fidgeting, not whispering, not even the occasional scratch or yawn that punctuated normal childhood existence. They simply waited. "All right, young scholars," Professor Kelnari announced, her voice carrying the practiced cheer of someone who genuinely loved her job. "Today we're going to learn about each other's cultural heritage. Each of you will have the opportunity to share something special from your homeworld." A chorus of excited squeaks, roars, and harmonic frequencies erupted from the class. Zixtal's head crest immediately puffed to twice its normal size, while Gorok began that low rumbling that Thackeray younglings made when anticipating violence, or, in this case, the chance to show off ancestral weapons. The Vesper triplets started that synchronized humming they did when they were collectively pleased about something. Through it all, Caleb and Amy continued to sit quietly, their faces showing polite interest. Nothing more, nothing less. Professor Kelnari felt her secondary stomach clench. She'd dealt with disruptive children before. That was normal, expected even. But children who were too well-behaved, that was unsettling. In the observation deck above the classroom, several parents had gathered for today's cultural exchange. It was meant to be a heartwarming display of interspecies cooperation and learning. Ambassador Jenna stood near the viewing window, beaming with maternal pride as she watched her twins. She'd been looking forward to this day for weeks, excited to see how well Caleb and Amy were integrating with their alien classmates. What she couldn't see was the growing cluster of other parents, backing away from her position near the window. "Is it just me?" whispered Velrax, a Krillian diplomat whose own offspring was currently demonstrating the lung capacity his species was famous for. "Or do those human younglings never move?" "I've been watching them for 20 minutes, muttered Thakmor, her reptilian features creased with concern. "They haven't shifted position once." "Not once! My Gorok can't sit still for 20 seconds without finding something to bite." "Perhaps they are ill," suggested one of the Vesper collective, their 3-part harmony creating an oddly melodic expression of worry. "We have observed no fidgeting behaviors, no attention-seeking displays, no territorial posturing." "That's what's wrong," Thakmor hissed softly. "They're 8 cycles old. They should be posturing constantly. How else do they establish dominance hierarchies? How do they practice combat skills? How do they— She stopped, her yellow eyes widening as a terrible thought occurred to her. Unless they've already established theirs. The group fell silent, watching as Professor Kelnari continued her lesson preparations below. Children of all species naturally test boundaries, the professor was explaining to her class, unaware of the growing parental anxiety above. It's how you learn about your place in the world. For example, young Krillians practice their territorial calls. Zixtal immediately demonstrated with an ear-splitting shriek that made 3 other students duck for cover, while Thakari cubs engage in playful combat to develop their hunting instincts. Gorok promptly lunged at the nearest classmate, who happened to be a Centaurian child with excellent reflexes and even better survival instincts. "Exactly," Professor Kelnari said brightly, as if having her students attempt to devour each other was perfectly normal Tuesday behavior. Which, to be fair, it was. She turned her attention to the human children. "And what about you, Caleb and Amy? What sorts of games do human children play?" Both children raised their hands politely and waited to be called upon. The classroom fell silent. Not the comfortable silence of sleeping younglings, or the tense quiet that preceded a particularly spectacular meltdown. This was different. This was the kind of silence that happened when every predatory instinct in the room suddenly screamed that something was very, very wrong. "Yes, Caleb?" Professor Kelnari managed, her voice only slightly higher than normal. "We play lots of games, Professor Kelnari," Caleb replied in a clear, respectful tone. "Would you like us to tell everyone about them during our presentation?" "That would be lovely," she replied, making a note on her tablet with one hand while the other 3 unconsciously moved to defensive positions. Amy raised her hand again. "Yes, Amy. Should we bring our show-and-tell items now? Or wait until it's our turn?" "Wait until your turn, dear." "Okay." Amy smiled brightly and folded her hands back on her desk. And there it was again. That perfect stillness, that patient waiting, that absolutely terrifying display of discipline. In the observation deck, Ambassador Jenna frowned slightly as she noticed the other parents had somehow migrated to the far side of the viewing area. "Is something wrong?" she asked, approaching the group. "You all look a bit tense." The parents exchanged glances, the kind of meaningful looks that parents shared when they were trying to figure out how to politely tell someone that their children might be possessed by ancient evil spirits. "Your younglings," Velrax began carefully. "They seem very focused." "Oh, they are," Jenna beamed. "Their teachers back on Earth always commented on how well-behaved they are. Sometimes I worry they're a bit too quiet, you know? Other human children their age can be quite energetic." The alien parents absorbed this information with the kind of horrified fascination normally reserved for watching star systems collapse. Too quiet. By human standards, these perfectly motionless, eerily patient children were considered too quiet. "What?" Thakmore's voice came out as barely a whisper. "What are normally active human children like?" Jenna laughed, a sound that somehow made everyone in the observation deck take an involuntary step backward. "Oh, you know how it is. Running around, climbing things, getting into everything, asking a million questions, never sitting still for more than a few minutes. Normal kid stuff." The parents contemplated this revelation in stunned silence. If human children who could sit motionless for hours while tracking every movement in a room with predatory precision were considered too quiet, what in the name of all that was sacred did normally active human younglings look like? Below them, Professor Kelnari was beginning to regret her career choices as she prepared to call the first presenter. But she was a professional, trained to handle any classroom situation with grace and competence. She just wished someone had warned her that any situation might include human children who were apparently so well trained in the art of patient observation that they could make a room full of natural predators nervous just by sitting politely. "All right, class," she announced, her voice carrying only the slightest tremor. "Let's begin our cultural presentations. Zixtal, would you like to go first?" The young Krillian's head crest fluffed with excitement as he bounded to the front of the class, traditional ceremonial weapons clanking against his carapace. Behind him, Caleb and Amy turned their heads in perfect unison to watch his presentation, their expressions pleasant and attentive. Somehow, that synchronized movement was the most terrifying thing anyone in that room had ever witnessed, and they hadn't even gotten to the human presentation yet. Zixtal bounded to the front of the classroom with the kind of enthusiasm that only came from having 4 lungs and absolutely no concept of indoor voices. His ceremonial armor, passed down through 18 generations of Krillian warriors, clanked and rattled with each step, creating a percussion section that would have made a military marching band proud. "Behold!" he shrieked, his voice hitting frequencies that made the classroom's windows vibrate ominously. "The ancient war dance of my people." What followed could generously be described as cultural expression, and more accurately labeled as barely controlled chaos. Zixtal leaped, spun, and howled his way through a routine that involved brandishing wickedly curved blades while performing acrobatic maneuvers that defied several laws of physics. His head crest flared to maximum extension, displaying the brilliant crimson and gold patterns that marked him as a descendant of the legendary Krillian berserkers. The other alien children responded with appropriate appreciation, which is to say, they cowered, cheered, and made various species-appropriate sounds of approval. Young Gorok gnashed his teeth in admiration. The Vesper triplets harmonized their excitement. A small Benatar child actually fainted from overstimulation, which was considered a compliment in Benatar culture. Through it all, Caleb and Amy watched with polite attention, their heads tilted at identical angles, hands still folded on their desks. They didn't flinch when Zixtal's blade whistled past their row. They didn't duck when he performed a particularly ambitious flip that sent his ancestral helmet flying across the room. They simply observed. When Zixtal finished his presentation with a war cry that rattled loose debris from the ceiling, the human children joined the applause with exactly the appropriate amount of enthusiasm. Not too much, not too little. Just perfect. "That was really cool, Zixtal," Amy said when the noise died down. "How long did it take you to learn all those moves?" Zixtal puffed with pride. "Many cycles. My battle instructors say I show great promise for future conquests." "That's wonderful," Caleb added with genuine warmth. "You're very talented." The Krillian youngling preened under the praise, completely missing the way every adult in the observation deck had gone pale at the exchange, because what the children had just witnessed wasn't a cultural dance. It was combat training, advanced combat training, and the human children had watched a demonstration of lethal fighting techniques with the same pleasant interest they might show for a nature documentary. Professor Kelnari cleared her throat, trying to regain control of her rapidly fraying nerves. "Wonderful presentation, Zixtal. Now, let's hear from our Vesper students." The 3 Vesper younglings rose in perfect synchronization, their semi-translucent forms shimmering as they moved to the front of the class. Where other species had individuals, The Vespers had, well, it was complicated. They were simultaneously three separate beings and one collective consciousness, which made parent-teacher conferences remarkably efficient and birthday parties absolutely terrifying. "We will demonstrate the harmony of shared thought," they announced in their trademark three-part chorus, voices weaving together in patterns that created meaning beyond words. What followed was beautiful, haunting, and completely alien to any species that valued individual consciousness. The triplets began to move in patterns that seemed random until you realized they were tracing mathematical equations in the air, complex formulas that described stellar formation, quantum mechanics, and the emotional resonance of color frequencies. Their voices rose and fell in harmonies that spoke directly to the listener's nervous system, conveying concepts that had no equivalent in spoken language. The other children watched in fascination as the Vespers shared memories, emotions, and experiences in real time, their collective consciousness painting pictures in the air that only they could fully understand. It was a glimpse into a completely different way of existing, where privacy was a foreign concept and loneliness was literally impossible. When they finished, settling back into their seats with the fluid grace of water finding its level, the classroom erupted in appreciative noises from species that could barely comprehend what they'd just witnessed. "Thank you for sharing that with us," Amy said, her voice carrying just the right note of appreciation. "It must be nice to never feel alone." "We do not understand the concept of alone," the triplets replied in unison, their heads tilting in curiosity. "Is this a common experience for singular consciousness species?" "Sometimes," Caleb answered thoughtfully. "But we have ways of dealing with it." The way he said "ways of dealing with it" sent a chill through every parent in the observation deck, though none of them could quite explain why. Professor Kelnari was beginning to develop what humans would recognize as a stress headache, though Zentorians experienced it as a painful molting sensation in their secondary carapace. "Excellent! Now, Gorok, would you like to share something from Thakari culture?" The young Thakari needed no further encouragement. He bounded to the front of the class with a predatory grace that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling to prey species. In his clawed hands, he carried a collection of what could charitably be called trophies, and more accurately described as evidence of successful hunts. "These belong to my great sire's greatest victories," Gorok announced, his fangs gleaming as he displayed skulls, claws, and other organic artifacts that probably violated several interstellar treaties regarding the transport of potentially hazardous biological materials. He proceeded to describe, in vivid detail, the hunting techniques used to acquire each trophy, how his ancestors had tracked their prey across 3 stars systems. The patients required to wait in ambush for rotation after rotation. The precision needed to take down creatures 10 times their size using nothing but natural weapons and cunning. The other alien children listened with rapt attention. This was the kind of story that appealed to younglings across the galaxy. Tales of courage, skill, and the triumph of cunning over brute force. Several of them made appreciative growling sounds when Gorok demonstrated the killing technique used on a particularly impressive specimen. Caleb and Amy watched with the same polite interest they'd shown the previous presentations. When Gorok finished by letting out a hunting howl that had been passed down through 20 generations of apex predators, they applauded with exactly the same measured enthusiasm they'd shown before. "Those are amazing family heirlooms," Amy commented. "Your great sire must have been very patient to track prey for so long." "The greatest hunters always are," Gorok replied, puffing with pride. patience separates true predators from mere scavengers. That's very wise, Caleb added. Patience is important. In the observation deck, Thakmor felt her blood run cold. Her son had just delivered a lecture on predatory patience to two human children, and they had received it with the kind of thoughtful consideration that suggested they were taking notes. More presentations followed, each one adding to the growing atmosphere of unease that seemed to center around the two perfectly behaved human children. A young aquarian demonstrated underwater breathing techniques that doubled as stealth training. Twin heliarch younglings showed off their ability to generate localized electromagnetic fields, a skill that was both beautiful light display and devastating weapon depending on the amplitude. Through it all, Caleb and Amy sat quietly, listened attentively, and offered appropriate compliments that somehow made every presentation sound like a briefing on advanced warfare techniques. By the time the last non-human presenter finished, Professor Kelnari had reached a conclusion that terrified her more than anything she'd encountered in 3 decades of education. The human children weren't just well-behaved. They were learning. Every technique, every strategy, every cultural advantage that had been shared in the spirit of innocent childhood show and tell, the human younglings had absorbed with the focused attention of military strategists studying enemy capabilities. And now it was their turn to present. "Caleb and Amy," Professor Kelnari called, her voice barely steady, "would you like to share something from human culture?" The twins stood in perfect unison, moved to the front of the class with fluid efficiency, and smiled at their classmates with warm, genuine expressions that somehow made every survival instinct in the room start screaming. "We'd love to," they said together, their voices carrying the kind of innocent enthusiasm that wars were fought to protect. Which was, as the galaxy was about to learn, exactly the problem. The moment had arrived. The human children stood at the front of the classroom with the kind of casual confidence that made every parent in the observation deck unconsciously check the exits. Caleb carried a small bag of items, while Amy held what appeared to be a simple data pad. Innocent enough props for what was about to become the most terrifying cultural presentation in galactic educational history. "We want to tell you about how human children spend their time," Amy began, her voice carrying that particularly dangerous combination of enthusiasm and sincerity that had toppled governments and started revolutions. "We brought some pictures and examples of our favorite activities." Professor Kelnari gripped her stylus so tightly that 2 of her hands began to cramp. Something about the way Amy said "activities" made it sound less like childhood games and more like mission briefings. The datapad flickered to life, displaying images that would have been heartwarming in any other context. Human children running through forests, hiding behind trees, chasing each other across open fields. Normal, innocent childhood activities that every species in the galaxy could recognize and appreciate. "This is called hide and seek," Caleb explained, with the patient tone of someone describing advanced military tactics to particularly slow students. One person closes their eyes and counts, while everyone else finds the best hiding spots they can. Then the seeker has to find them using only visual tracking and logical deduction. The alien children leaned forward with interest. That sounded like fun. Several species had similar games, but in the observation deck, Velrax felt his head crest flatten against his skull in horror. Visual tracking. Logical deduction. The human child was describing advanced reconnaissance training with the casual air of someone discussing the weather. "The goal," Amy added helpfully, "is to stay hidden for as long as possible, while observing the seeker's search patterns. You have to control your breathing, remain completely still, and wait for the perfect moment to move to a better position. Stealth training. Advanced stealth training. With breath control and tactical positioning. Sometimes we play team hide-and-seek, Caleb continued, clicking to the next image. That's where you work together to avoid detection, while coordinating movement between hiding spots. The best teams can stay hidden for hours. Squad-based infiltration exercises. The human children were casually describing squad-based infiltration exercises. Young Gorok raised his claw. What happens if you get caught? The twins exchanged a look that somehow made the temperature in the room drop 3 degrees. You're eliminated, they said in unison. The way they said eliminated suggested that in human culture, failure had consequences. But that's okay. Amy brightened immediately. Because then you learn from your mistakes and do better next time. Humans are very good at adapting their strategies. Professor Kelnari felt her secondary stomach begin to tie itself in knots. Adaptation, strategic learning, consequence-based training protocols. What kind of civilization raised their children with elimination-based learning systems? Another game we love is called tag, Caleb said, advancing to the next image. One person is it and has to catch the others by touching them, but everyone else tries to avoid being caught by using speed, agility, and tactical movement. The display showed human children running in complex patterns, changing direction unpredictably, using obstacles for cover, and demonstrating the kind of evasive maneuvers that would make military instructors weep with pride. The really advanced version is called freeze tag, Amy added. When you're caught, you have to stop moving until someone else can get close enough to unfreeze you without being caught themselves. Search and rescue operations. Under hostile conditions. With mobile enemy forces. And then there's capture the flag. Both twins lit up with genuine excitement, their faces glowing with the kind of joy that children usually reserved for ice cream and birthday presents. That's where you split into 2 teams and try to steal the other team's flag while defending your own base. The classroom fell into the kind of silence that occurred when multiple civilizations simultaneously realized they had vastly underestimated a potential threat. Each team has to plan their attack strategy while also setting up defensive positions, Caleb explained with the enthusiasm of a general describing his favorite battle. You need scouts to gather intelligence, defenders to protect your territory, and strike teams to infiltrate enemy positions. The best part, Amy continued, is that you have to do all of this while the other team is trying to do the same thing to you. So you're constantly adapting your tactics based on enemy movement patterns and defensive capabilities. Real-time strategic warfare simulation, with intelligence gathering, territorial defense, and adaptive tactical response protocols. In the observation deck, Ambassador Jenna watched with growing confusion as the other parents backed away from her position near the viewing window. Several of them had gone pale, and one Aquarian diplomat appeared to be hyperventilating through his gill slits. "Is everything all right?" she asked. "The children seem to be doing wonderfully." Thakmor turned to stare at her with the kind of expression normally reserved for natural disasters or cosmic horror entities. "Your younglings," she whispered, "are describing military training exercises." "What? Oh no, they're just games." Jenna laughed, the sound somehow making everyone in the vicinity flinch. "All human children play these games. They're perfectly normal. All human children." The words hit the assembled parents like a meteor impact. All human children were trained in stealth operations, tactical warfare, and strategic adaptation. From childhood. as a normal part of their development. Below them, the presentation continued with the relentless efficiency of a well-planned campaign. Of course, not all human games are about running around, Amy said, switching to a new set of images. Sometimes we play quiet games that teach concentration and patience. The assembled alien children perked up. Finally, something that sounded peaceful. This is called red light, green light, Caleb explained. Everyone lines up at one end of a field, and one person stands at the other end with their back turned. When they say green light, you can move toward them. But when they say red light and turn around, you have to freeze completely. If they see you moving, you're out. Simple enough. Several species had games that required stillness and control. The tricky part, Amy added with a smile that could have powered a small star, is that the person giving commands can say red light at any time, without warning. So you have to be ready to stop instantly, no matter what position you're in or how off balance you might be. Instant response conditioning. Combat reflex training. Absolute obedience to command structures under unpredictable circumstances. And you have to stay completely still, Caleb continued. No breathing too hard, no shifting to get comfortable, no fidgeting at all. Even the tiniest movement gets you eliminated. Military discipline training, with immediate consequences for failure to maintain perfect control. The winner is whoever reaches the commander first, Amy concluded. But they have to do it by being patient, observant, and ready to stop instantly when ordered. One of the Vesper triplets raised their collective hand. What happens to those who are eliminated? They have to watch the rest of the game and learn from their mistakes, Caleb replied matter-of-factly. Humans believe that watching successful strategies is almost as valuable as practicing them yourself. Forced observation of superior tactical performance. Strategic analysis under elimination pressure. The human children were describing a training system that would have impressed the most hardened military academies in the galaxy. Professor Kelnari realized she was now openly molting from stress, her carapace shedding small flakes onto her desk. And these games are played by all human children? Oh yes, Amy beamed. Startin' when we're very small. By the time we're our age, most humans can play these games for hours without getting tired or losing focus. Hours, without losing focus. The professor did some quick mental calculations and felt her primary stomach join her secondary one in performing acrobatic knots of anxiety. But the best part about human games, Caleb said, his voice taking on that special tone that suggested the truly horrifying revelation was yet to come, is how they teach us to work together as a team while also thinking independently. Like when we sing songs, Amy added brightly. Songs. Maybe songs would be harmless. Maybe human music was just music. The datapad switched to an image of human adults singing to small children, their faces gentle and loving in the soft light of what appeared to be a sleeping chamber. Human parents sing lullabies to help their children fall asleep, Amy explained. These songs have been passed down for thousands of generations. Generational knowledge transfer through audio conditioning during vulnerable sleep states. The songs usually tell stories about staying safe, being brave, and remembering that your family will always protect you, Caleb added. They help children feel calm and secure, even when they're alone in the dark. Psychological conditioning for isolation scenarios. Emotional stability training for high-stress situations. And the rhythm helps regulate breathing and heart rate, Amy continued, with the helpful tone of someone explaining basic physiology to medical students. So, children learn to control their body's responses even while unconscious. Autonomic nervous system conditioning. During sleep cycles, from infancy. The silence in the observation deck had evolved beyond mere horror and into something approaching existential crisis. The assembled parents were beginning to understand that humanity wasn't just another species with unusual child-rearing practices. They were a species that had accidentally created the most comprehensive childhood military training program in galactic history, then convinced themselves it was just playing games and singing songs. "We brought one more thing to share," Caleb announced, reaching into his bag. Every parent in the observation deck simultaneously stepped backward, as if whatever the human child was about to reveal might explode on contact with alien sensibilities. What he pulled out was a simple wooden toy, a small horse mounted on a curved base that could rock back and forth. "This is a rocking horse," Amy explained. "Human children sit on it and rock back and forth to practice balance and coordination. Balance training equipment for developing core stability and dynamic equilibrium. But the really important part," Caleb added, "is that it teaches patience and rhythm. You can't just rock as fast as you want, or you'll fall off. You have to find the right pace and maintain it for as long as you want to keep playing. Endurance conditioning, with built-in failure consequences for loss of control or rhythm disruption." Professor Kelnari stared at the innocent wooden toy with the kind of fascination usually reserved for ancient weapons of mass destruction. Because that's essentially what it was, a training device designed to produce children with superior balance, patience, and rhythmic control. Just like everything else in human culture, it was simultaneously wholesome childhood entertainment and military preparation. But the twins weren't finished. Oh no, they had saved the best for last. "We also want to tell you about our favorite holiday traditions," Amy announced, with the kind of infectious enthusiasm that made warfare sound like a birthday party. The datapad flickered to a new image, showing human families gathered around decorated trees, children sitting in neat rows, adults distributing wrapped packages with military precision. "This is called Christmas," Caleb explained. "Once a year, human families gather to celebrate by giving gifts to children who have demonstrated good behavior throughout the previous cycle. Behavioral conditioning reinforcement through scheduled reward distribution based on annual performance metrics." "But here's the really interesting part," Amy continued, her eyes sparkling with genuine delight. "Before you get your gifts, you have to prove you've been good by sitting quietly while the adults evaluate your conduct for the entire year. Annual behavioral assessment protocols with material incentive structures. And if you haven't met the behavioral standards?" Gorok asked, his predatory curiosity getting the better of him. The twins exchanged another one of those looks that seemed to lower the room's temperature. "Well, there are consequences," Caleb said, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing natural law. "But most human children learn pretty quickly how to meet expectations. Performance-based resource allocation with negative reinforcement for compliance failures. The gift-giving process is really efficient too," Amy added helpfully. "Everyone sits in designated positions while one person distributes items according to predetermined criteria. No pushing, no grabbing, no fighting over resources. Everyone waits their turn. Organized resource distribution drill with crowd control protocols and disciplinary oversight." Professor Kelnari felt her molting accelerate. Even human celebrations were disguised training exercises in order, discipline, and behavioral modification. "But the most important tradition," Caleb continued, "is that children have to express gratitude for everything they receive, even if it's not what they wanted. It teaches emotional control and strategic social responses. mandatory emotional regulation training with diplomatic response protocols under potential disappointment stress. And then there's Halloween. Amy's face lit up with pure joy. That's when human children practice advanced camouflage techniques. The room went so quiet that the station's life support systems sounded like a thunderstorm. Camouflage techniques, Professor Kelnari whispered. We call it wearing costumes, Caleb explained cheerfully. Children disguise themselves as different creatures, objects, or even other people, then move through residential areas testing their ability to maintain character while interacting with adults. Identity concealment. Operations with real-time performance evaluation under civilian interaction protocols. The goal is to convince as many adults as possible that you're really whatever you're pretending to be, Amy added. The better your disguise and acting skills, the more treats you collect. Deep cover infiltration exercises with material rewards for successful deception. Children spend weeks preparing their disguises, studying their chosen identities, and practicing mannerisms, Caleb continued with the enthusiasm of someone describing their favorite hobby. Some of the advanced costumes are so convincing that even family members can't recognize the child wearing them. Extended preparation phases for identity assumption with psychological method acting components. In the observation deck, several parents had begun quietly discussing emergency evacuation procedures. Not from the station, from this entire sector of the galaxy. And the best part, Amy concluded, with a smile that could have powered a small war fleet, is that adults actually encourage this behavior. They give children extra treats for the most convincing disguises and creative deceptions. State-sanctioned deception training with adult supervision and performance incentives. How long do these training exercises last? Zixtal asked, his head crest now completely flattened against his skull. Oh, Halloween is just one night, Caleb replied, but humans practice all year round. We have school plays where we pretend to be historical figures, imagination games where we create entire fictional scenarios, and storytelling exercises where we learn to make unreal things sound believable. Year-round psychological conditioning in deception, improvisation, and narrative manipulation. The Vesper triplets began harmonizing in what could only be described as a collective nervous breakdown. Don't worry, though, Amy said, apparently noticing the increasing distress in her audience. These are all just fun activities that help human children develop creativity and social skills. Creativity. Social skills. The aliens were beginning to understand that when humans said creativity, they meant adaptive problem-solving under pressure, and when they said social skills, they meant advanced psychological manipulation techniques. Any questions? Both twins asked together, their synchronized voices carrying across the now silent classroom like a death knell for galactic peace of mind. And the most terrifying part of all? The human children had no idea. The silence that followed the twins' presentation stretched on for what felt like geological epochs. Professor Kelnari stared at her two perfectly polite human students, her four hands frozen in mid-gesture, her compound eyes wide with the kind of existential terror normally reserved for cosmic horror scenarios or tax audits. "Thank you for sharing your culture with us," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "That was very informative." The twins beamed with pride, completely oblivious to the fact that they had just delivered what amounted to a comprehensive briefing on humanity's childhood military preparation protocols. "You're welcome, Professor Kelnari," Amy chirped. "We love sharing human traditions." "Should we sit down now?" Caleb asked politely. Yes, the professor croaked. Please, sit, and, and perhaps we should take an early recess. The moment the words left her mouth, every non-human child in the classroom bolted for the exits with the kind of desperate speed usually seen during station-wide emergencies. Young Gorok actually phased through his desk in his haste to escape. The Vesper triplets achieved a level of synchronized panic that would have been impressive under other circumstances. Within 30 seconds, the classroom was empty except for Professor Kelnari and the two human children, who remained seated with their hands folded, looking mildly confused by their classmates' sudden departure. "Did we say something wrong?" Amy asked with genuine concern. Professor Kelnari looked at the sweet, innocent faces of her human students and felt her sanity make a small whimpering sound. "No, dear. You were perfect. As always." In the observation deck, Ambassador Jenna stood alone, watching her children through the viewing window while behind her, the Emergency Committee of Alien Parents conducted what could generously be called a strategic planning session, and more accurately described as barely controlled mass hysteria. "We need to contact the Galactic Education Council immediately," Velrex was saying, his head crest cycling through colors that indicated extreme distress. "This changes everything we thought we knew about human development protocols." "Forget the Education Council," Thakmor hissed. "We need to inform the Defense Ministry. If human children are receiving this level of training as a matter of course, what does that suggest about adult human capabilities?" "Perhaps we should request a full cultural assessment," suggested one of the Vesper Collective, their three-part harmony now carrying distinctly ominous undertones. "We need to understand the scope of their educational system." Ambassador Jenna turned to face the group, her expression shifting from confusion to something approaching alarm. "I'm sorry, but are you suggesting there's something wrong with the way humans raise their children?" The alien parents exchanged glances that conveyed entire conversations worth of terror and diplomatic necessity. "Ambassador," Velrax began carefully, "when you describe human childhood activities, you're essentially describing the most comprehensive military training program any of us have ever encountered." "Military training?" Jenna laughed, though the sound now carried an edge that made several parents step backward. "They're just games. Every human child plays them. It's completely normal." That was exactly the problem. Before anyone could respond, Professor Kelnari's voice crackled through the observation deck's communication system. "Could Ambassador Jenna please report to the classroom? We have a situation." Jenna hurried down to find her children sitting exactly where she'd last seen them, while Professor Kelnari stood at the far end of the room, using her desk as a barrier between herself and the twins. "Is everything all right?" Jenna asked. "Your children," Professor Kelnari began, then stopped, apparently struggling to find words that wouldn't sound completely insane. "They've been very educational today." "I'm glad to hear it." They were so excited about sharing human culture. At that moment, the classroom's communication system chimed with an incoming priority message. The screen flickered to life, displaying the official seal of Earth's Department of Education. "Greetings, Nexus Academy," came a cheerful voice from what appeared to be a standard government office. "This is Director Patricia Hawkins from the Terra Educational Exchange Program. I wanted to personally thank you for participating in our cultural outreach initiative." Ambassador Jenna frowned. "I don't remember scheduling any official communications." "Your facility has provided invaluable data on how human educational standards compare to those of other species," the director continued brightly. "We're particularly interested in your observations regarding behavioral compliance, attention span, and collaborative learning protocols. Professor Kelnari felt her primary and secondary stomachs form a complex knot that would have impressed professional sailors. I'm pleased to report that Caleb and Amy are performing well within normal parameters for their age group, Director Hawkins continued. Their teachers back on Earth noted that they occasionally need reminders to sit still during extended lessons and sometimes get a bit excited during group presentations. We're delighted to hear they've been more subdued in the academy environment. The recording paused, and Director Hawkins's expression shifted to something that could charitably be called concerned, and more accurately described as mildly disappointed. However, we have received some concerning reports about their energy levels. Their Earth-based instructors describe them as quite active and occasionally hyperactive, particularly during physical education periods. We trust that the Academy's structured environment is helping them develop better self-control. Ambassador Jenna stared at the screen in growing horror as the implications began to sink in. If these children, who could sit motionless for hours while observing military-grade combat demonstrations, were considered hyperactive by human standards. In closing, Director Hawkins concluded cheerfully, we hope this exchange proves mutually beneficial. Human children have so much to learn from observing species with less, shall we say, structured approaches to childhood development. Thank you again for your cooperation. The transmission ended, leaving the classroom in absolute silence. Professor Kelnari was the first to speak, her voice barely audible. Less structured approaches? Your educational system, Ambassador Jenna said slowly, as if the words were forming in her mouth against her will, considers my children to be restless? Sometimes they wiggle during story time, Amy offered helpfully. And Caleb sometimes asks to get water when he's supposed to be sitting quietly, added her brother with the air of someone confessing to minor criminal activity. The full magnitude of the situation crashed over everyone present like a tidal wave of pure, crystallized terror. If children who demonstrated textbook military discipline were considered undisciplined by human standards, then what did properly behaved human children look like? The answer, everyone realized with growing horror, was probably classified information. Professor Kelnari began updating her resume in her head, while simultaneously calculating the nearest escape pod's capacity. Ambassador Jenna sat down heavily in the nearest chair, finally understanding why the other parents had been backing away from her all day. And somewhere in the depths of space, the Galactic Defense Council's threat assessment algorithms quietly bumped humanity's danger rating up several categories, not because they were aggressive or warlike, but because they had apparently achieved something far more terrifying than military supremacy. They had created a civilization where perfect soldiers thought they were just playing games. The twins, meanwhile, gathered their show and tell materials and prepared to return to their afternoon lessons, blissfully unaware that they had just triggered the galaxy's first-ever existential crisis, caused by excessive politeness. After all, they were only human.